There's been a lot of speculation in recent years that the Heisman Trophy, one of college football's most prestigious awards, is becoming a quarterback award. Now, what is that assumption really based on? Today, I'm going to dive a bit more into the history of the Heisman Trophy, some of its winners from its earliest years up until today, and truly try to answer the question of, is the Heisman Trophy a quarterback award, and will it still be one in years to come? Now, why this particular topic? Well, there were two main reasons as to why I chose this topic. The first is because of recent observations and overall interest in Heisman Trophy races. I've been highly invested in college football ever since I was little. And a couple years ago, one of my personal favorite players, Aiden Hutchinson, very close to winning the Heisman Trophy and very close debate there, and truly made me think about if whether or not this award is truly becoming a quarterback award. The second reason as to why I chose this topic is I wanted to look to discover if the modern game is one of the main reasons for this speculation. Is it because of the offensive schemes, the prioritization of the quarterback over other positions? Like, what is potentially the answer, if there even is one? So those are a couple of the reasons as to why I chose this topic. Now, it's important to dive into the history of the Heisman Trophy to truly understand and potentially answer whether or not this is becoming a quarterback award. So, John Heisman, the man that this trophy is named after, was a good player, but he was an even better coach. In college, he actually played the tackle position and briefly, I believe, played the center position too, but he coached at several schools, most notably at Georgia Tech. He was actually the coach for the massive blowout that occurred about 100 years ago against Cumberland. I believe it was 222-0. But that's where he coached, one of the game's most prolific coaches for sure, and also one of its great innovators. He helped legalize the forward pass in 1906, originated the snap coming from the center, and even promoted quarters instead of having halves back then. He was also the AD of the Downtown Athletic Club in New York City. And the importance of that is that this is where the Heisman Trophy ceremony was originally held up until the year 2001. And John Heisman, of course, passed away in 1935. And ever since then, the Heisman Memorial Trophy was named in his honor and began being annually given to the best, most outstanding college football player in the country every year, starting in 1935. And as we've talked about in class before, that first Heisman Trophy winner was Jay Berwanger of the University of Chicago. This is where his trophy resides today. This is what it looks like. There's a picture of him on the left, and then a little bit of a description about him. But the first Heisman Trophy winner was Chicago's Jay Berwanger, 1935. Now, who are some of the most prolific players before 1935 that potentially would have won this award if it existed beforehand? Now, one of the main ones that we've talked about in our class before is certainly Willie Heston. He played at Michigan for 4 years in the early 1900s through some of his best teams. And here were some of the crazy stats that he has under his belt. So 400 plus yards against Kalamazoo in 1904, 38 carries in that same year against Chicago, 71 career touchdowns, which is the most in Michigan history. Also tied for the most points, I believe, with Jake Moody. Two-time All-American, 4 national championships, and never lost a game. The only one where he didn't win was that tie against Minnesota. And, of course, it's pretty easy to assume that he's one of the greatest Wolverines to ever play at Michigan. Would he have won the Heisman? I think it's pretty safe to say he would have. Other likely winners, though, include Charles Daly, Jim Thorpe, Frank Stakiti. I don't actually know if I pronounced that correct or not. Hopefully I did. George Gipp, the Gipper, of course, Red Grange, one of college football's best at the time, and Benny Oosterbaan, Harry Newman, and all those players right there with the asterisks. Those were Michigan players. So Michigan could have had 3 extra Heisman Trophy winners, and then obviously Willie Heston as well. But these are a lot of them played halfback, of course, too. Not all of them, of course, obviously, as you can tell here. But many of them did also play the halfback or the running back position, whichever you want to call it. But let's move on to the 1900s for this award and kind of really dive further into uh, uh, who the Heisman Trophy went to in these years. So from 1935 up until just before the turn of the millennium, of course, backs, whatever it may be, running backs, halfbacks, fullbacks, they won the award 41 times. Running backs obviously make up almost all of that, but 41 times in comparison to every other position. The quarterback, 18, of course, and then receivers, tight ends, cornerbacks, which is Charles Woodson, of course. Not nearly as many as the other two, the backs and the quarterbacks. So as you can tell, very obviously the halfback, one of the most important and spectacular positions in the country at the time. And I also talked with Seth Fisher to kind of get his stance on why this might be.
Until the 1950s, a quarterback is not allowed to throw from the pocket. So your quarterback is not your main offensive engine. He's your offensive coordinator. He's a little guy, and his job is to be small enough that they can't see where the ball is going and be a little bit of a blocker and sometimes a runner. But I mean, he's not the main star. In order to pass the ball, you had to get outside of the pocket. So who was that? That was the halfbacks. Who won in the 1930s and 40s? You know, Niall Kinnick, right? Tom Harmon, Frank Sickwich from Georgia, Les Horvath from Ohio State. Halfbacks. Those are halfbacks. Well, what do? They're the quarterbacks of their team, right? Tom Harmon, basically, I mean, he's the J.J. McCarthy, not the Blake Corum of Michigan. He was also the Will Johnson of Michigan, right? So he was playing both roles. So you got to see it in both sides. And you use your most athletic guy at halfback because that's your edge defender. That's the one guy who's going to be able to stop all the weird stuff that goes on to get, the chase things down. It's not your safety. He's far back. He's your punt returner. It's usually your halfbacks, the stars on defense as well. The halfbacks in the center, which is the middle linebacker.
So as Seth kind of touched on there, the halfback, not only the best at his position, of course, but pretty much the best athlete on the team that could play at different positions. Now, of course, that was in the earlier part of this of these decades, but even as the years kind of progressed, the halfback was really just the standout athlete overall and really the most valuable player on each team. Hence why these running backs could really just be seen as the most outstanding and best college football players in the country. Now, there we go. Now, Tom Harmon was one of them for sure, and we've talked about him in this class before too. First Michigan player to ever win the award in 1940. And here are some statistics over his 3-year career just to show like how dominant he really was and outstanding among many other halfbacks of his time. Ran for over 2,000 yards. He even had 100 pass completions for over 1,300 yards, a defensive star and kicking duties as well. So he really was a star all around the field. He had that 5-touchdown game against California and his famous game against Ohio State, where they won 40-0. 3 rushing touchdowns, 2 passing touchdowns, 3 interceptions. He even punted the ball 3 times and kicked 4 extra points. Just truly remarkable. And this kind of shows not only why he won the Heisman, but why many other backs at the time especially won the Heisman Trophy. Some other notable Wolverines to win the Heisman, of course, and these are some of the very few that were not halfbacks to win the award, but felt right to highlight, of course, in Michigan history. Desmond Howard, 1991, the 3rd wide receiver to win the award. He tied set 5 NCAA records and 12 single season Michigan records. Led the Big Ten in scoring one year. Had 19 receiving touchdowns this season and 2 rushing touchdowns, as well as a couple on kick and punt returns against one of them being, of course, Ohio State, his famous punt return. And then also the 2nd largest margin of victory in Heisman voting history ever belongs to him. Along with him is Charles Woodson, 1997, the only defensive player to ever win the award. On defense, 7 interceptions. On offense, he actually had a receiving touchdown and over 200 yards receiving as well, and that punt return touchdown versus Ohio State. along with leading the Wolverines to an undefeated national championship that year. So truly some very outstanding college football players. Highlighted one of the most prolific halfbacks, but also kind of touched on some of the key players outside of that position group, just to showcase how, despite the halfbacks dominating this award at the time, that there were really just great overall players at differing positions, of course, as we can see with Charles Woodson and Desmond Howard. Other notable winners in this wide time frame: Barry Sanders, of course, arguably the best Heisman winner in this group; Herschel Walker of Georgia; Marcus Allen of USC; Archie Griffin in the top right, the only two-time Heisman Trophy winner in consecutive years still; Roger Staubach, Billy Sims, and Doc Blanchard in the bottom right there were also a couple of key Heisman Trophy winners, or really just more notable ones than many of the others that did win the award. And then some of the notable races. In 1985, Bo Jackson barely edged out Iowa quarterback Chuck Long, 45 voting points. And again, that's a halfback winning the Heisman Trophy, this time over a quarterback. Along with that was the 1961 race, with Ernie Davis beating out Bob Ferguson by 53 voting points. And then about 5 years before that, we had Paul Hornung just beating out John Majors by 72 votes. So really some tight races, but one of the key takeaways here is that the halfback position just truly dominated the award races at this time. Now, fast forwarding to the 2000s, we have the quarterback. Out of 22 possible Heisman Trophy awards, they've won 19 of them so far. And that's part of the reason for this speculation, of course. Here are some of the notable ones, of course: Caleb Williams, Tim Tebow, Joe Burrow right there on the far right, but really just been dominated by the quarterback. And this kind of leads me to one of the topics I talked about at the beginning, the 2021 Heisman Trophy debate. Kenneth Walker on the left, one of the best running backs, not only at the time, but arguably in this millennium. Aiden Hutchinson in the middle, a true leader, one of the best defensive players in the country, led Michigan back to glory. And Will Anderson Jr., kind of an under-the-radar talent, had arguably much better stats than Aiden Hutchinson did, but didn't even make it to the Heisman ceremony. And the winner of that year was quarterback Bryce Young, who now plays for the Carolina Panthers, #1 overall pick. Did he deserve it more than these three? Now let's kind of dive into that. Kenneth Walker, 18 touchdowns on the ground, over 1,600 rushing yards, scored a ton of points in just 12 games, and he really didn't even play in all 12. He was kind of hurt for some of them. Aiden Hutchinson, 14 sacks on the season, many of those in some of the biggest games of the season for the Wolverines. And then Will Anderson Jr., 31 and a half tackles for a loss, truly remarkable, and 15 and a half sacks, but not a lot of people noticed it. What they did notice was Bryce Young's stellar season: 43 touchdown passes compared to 4 picks, 3 rushing touchdowns, and over 4,300 passing yards. He did have a truly remarkable season, and in my personal opinion, I do believe he won the Heisman Trophy. But is this because offenses nowadays typically prioritize the quarterback position more and focus on getting them the football, letting them be the leader, and running the offense? Or is it for a different reason? I believe it is for the first reason, but we will touch on this topic a little bit more moving forward. 2000, also the 2000 Heisman Trophy debate kind of illustrates this key point over here as to how the quarterback, yeah, they could have won it some years, but should they have won it each of these years? So Chris Weinke of Florida State, pretty good season, right? Not as good as Bryce Young's, but still a pretty good season. And on the right, we have LaDainian Tomlinson, a true star in the NFL. He had over 2,100 rushing yards and 22 touchdowns. Not only did he not win the Heisman Trophy, he didn't finish in second. He didn't even finish in third. He got fourth in the Heisman Trophy voting behind 3 other quarterbacks. To me, that's shocking. Averaging almost 6 yards a carry. And sure, he might have played lesser competition, but over 2,100 rushing yards in a single season is outstanding. But could it have been Chris Weinke led Florida State to a great season? That could have been part of the picture. 2003, same idea. Jason White led Oklahoma to a great season as well. 3,800 passing yards, 40 touchdowns. Great season. Better than Chris Weinke. Larry Fitzgerald, though, 1,600 receiving yards and 22 touchdowns. He had a great season, too. Would turn out to be a star in the NFL as well. But it seemed his team was not nearly as good as Oklahoma. Could that have played a major role in Jason White winning this award over Larry Fitzgerald? Well, let's look at Matt Leinart over Adrian Peterson, the true freshman in 2004. Leinart led USC to a national championship, 33 touchdowns, 3,300 passing yards, compared to Adrian Peterson only getting 1,900 rushing yards, 15 rushing touchdowns. And I don't say only saying, wow, you only got that many. I say only saying in that context, meaning how did he not even come close to winning the Heisman Trophy? I don't even believe he got second place in his Heisman Trophy voting as well. Matt Leinart won the award, and I believe just leading his team to a national championship is a major reason as to why he won this award, just like many others. But some other notable winners of this time period: Joe Burrow, Cam Newton on the far right, Derrick Henry, Tim Tebow, Money Manziel on the bottom, and then we got Marcus Mariota at the top, kind of striking the Heisman pose while he's doing his stiff arm, and Jameis Winston of Florida State. And then some notable races: Mark Ingram, 2009, beats out running back Toby Gerhart of Stanford by 28 voting points, one of the closest races in history of the Heisman Trophy. And Ndamukong Suh of Nebraska, arguably one of college football's greatest defenders ever, didn't even get top 3 in the voting. 2001, Eric Crouch beats out Rex Grossman of Florida by 62 voting points. The Nebraska quarterback edged out Mr. Grossman. Could it have been because Nebraska had a great season? I think so. 2008, Sam Bradford beats out Colt McCoy by 122 voting points. Colt McCoy would actually go on to not win it the next year too, but would almost take Texas to a national championship that following year. Instead, Sam Bradford falls short in the national championship, but takes home some hardware in doing so. So, is the Heisman Trophy a quarterback award? A lot of information has been presented, obviously, with all these numbers, all these races, all these statistics, all these debates. But is it truly a quarterback award, or are we just in a new era compared to that of the backs, the halfbacks, the running backs in the 1900s? Well, the numbers don't really lie. 28% of Heisman Trophy winners were quarterbacks in the 1900s, whereas 86% of them were of the Heisman Trophy winners were quarterbacks in this millennium. That is crazy to think about. 86%. That's all but 3 have been quarterbacks. How have running backs not won the award more? How have cornerbacks, defensive backs, defensive linemen, offensive linemen, kickers not won the award? Well, and even moreover on that point, the 2023 Heisman Trophy race, top 3 frontrunners right now are all quarterbacks, and the closest to winning it, not a quarterback, is Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State. So why is that? Well, I talked with Seth Fisher to get his insight.
I think that you have to let the times play out, and it's best to keep things. College football is very messy. It's very sloppy. Like whenever we try to come up with a playoff at the end of the year, we always end up with either too many teams in the playoff or not enough, right? Like last year, you could have just had Michigan play Georgia, and everyone would have been like, "Oh yeah, BCS works," right? Because you didn't need Ohio State. Ohio State, the best they could do is beat Michigan and be 1-1 against Michigan with a loss at home, right? The field did not need to be the field, but try to create a system. Whenever you create a system, you're locking yourself in. Sometimes you need that system. If you don't need the system, don't have one. So the idea of, this should be a quarterback award, I think some of that comes from Tennessee and by extension SEC fans who are still mad that a black cornerback from Michigan won over the good old-fashioned white boy from the South. I think that is very much part of the original conversation because I was alive at that time. And anyone who says that that wasn't part of the conversation is lying to you. Everyone who was alive at that time knew that that was definitely a part of the conversation. And it's not something that you can talk about that much today because it's not it's not as acceptable now to have that underpinning your conversation, right? We've changed that. But that's important. Things need to change. You need to have room to change. If you make it only an offensive award, then you have a defensive guy. If that was the way we originally did it, fine. The original idea was to have, one guy because he was going to play offense and defense. It makes some sense. I think if you split it, you're going to make it half as important. I think that it should be available to defensive players. I think there have been defensive players that should have earned it. I think there's only been one defensive player who has, and I think that's a shame because there are other guys who deserved it. And you're going to get an Ndamukong Suh again, who's going to make the game all about him. Now, the game has to change to that. Ndamukong Suh is part of a certain time in college football when a lot of teams are running zone read offenses and using their quarterbacks as runners. How do you defeat that offense? Your defensive tackle is unblockable. He was perfect for his time. I think in a time when quarterbacks are, and I don't think this is always going to last, quarterbacks right now are a much bigger part of their offenses. I think slowly the game is changing to make that less true because teams are focusing on how to mess with quarterbacks. The more time defenses spend on screwing around with quarterbacks, the less valuable a quarterback's going to be, and more valuable other aspects of your team are going to matter.
All right. Well, I cut it short a little bit, as you can tell. But moving on a little bit, he mentioned how Ndamukong Suh, for example, was perfect for his time, perfect for his era. Now, one of the key things I want to go off of that is we might just simply be in an era where the quarterback is just the most dominant at this time. It might not just be that, hey, running backs aren't as valuable anymore, or maybe defensive players aren't valuable in general. Well, maybe they might be in 15 years. Maybe it's just the era we are in right now. And I think that's where we truly are. Given all that I've said so far, it was once the running backs were most valuable and it was a run heavy game. And with the transition to pass heavy offenses, the quarterback is now the most valuable player. So I think it's just, we are in a new era we've been in an era of the quarterback being the most valuable player. And that's why the quarterback has won it the most so far. So who knows what the future holds? Will an offensive lineman be the most valuable player? A linebacker? Will it be a kicker or a punter or a return man? Who knows what the future holds? But in conclusion, the quarterback award, the Heisman Trophy being a quarterback award, may simply just be because we are in a new era of college football compared to the past, being dominated by running backs. Thank you, and go Blue.